Alright everybody, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker and here we are in Victoria 3 playing Line Go Up, UI and Topline metrics. So this is a video in a playlist where I'm going to be trying to teach you how to do line go up from the very basics, while also sprinkling in some fun 19th century flavor and giving you some historical context for what we're doing in game. Because Victoria 3 really is a grand strategy game, but it's also very critically a historical simulation game, and I think that the way that the game models a lot of stuff is actually quite fun. It just kind of depends on what sort of flavor you're looking for. But I think Paradox Interactive has done a pretty good job of demonstrating the interplay between money and power that existed in politics in the 19th century. So here in 1836, we are playing as Sardinia-Piedmont. Sardinia-Piedmont is the nation that historically actually oversees the unification of Italy, but at the beginning of the game, we're meaningfully weaker than our rival to the south, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Here as Sardinia-Piedmont, we are going to see the formation of Italy, largely because by creating Italy, we are going to see line go up, but we're also going to be talking about like what lines are important, how to manipulate them. So before we jump in on the game, let's discuss the UI and the top line metrics. So the first thing that I think everyone should do is open up your outliner. Just mouse over here, click on this outliner, or hit Shift F1, and then put stars on a couple of really critical things. This will pin these critical things to your outliner over here and make your life way easier moving forward, I promise. So I recommend pinning interest groups, commanders, politicians, and states as just broad categories, and then observing everything else back end. But fortunately, the game's UI has gotten a lot better since release, and it's much better at giving you important information and only important information instead of just like a slew of notifications that didn't mean anything, like, oh my god, people are moving to the middle of nowhere in Canada. So let's first discuss these top line numbers. The top line literally are these things called capacities. We have bureaucracy, authority, influence, convoys, and money. These aren't really mana so much as they are upkeep costs for a lot of things, but each of them in turn represents something real, and each of them in turn allows you to do things that are gamified representations of real things in the real world. So let's start with bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is sort of the resource of statecraft. It's the thing that you need in order to have incorporated states. These are states that are critical parts of the nation, things that are identified not as colonies, but as rightful French clay or rightful Sardinian clay. Incorporated states are also important because pops living there will actually pay taxes. Pops living in unincorporated colonial territories are not going to be paying taxes to you, and so growing your incorporated state population is really important when it comes to growing your economy. You also have to grow your bureaucracy as your government becomes more complicated. In this case, institutions represent sort of permanent laws that the government is responsible for governing. Sardinia-Piedmont, for instance, begins with a level 1 law enforcement on the books, and this level 1 law enforcement provides us bonuses in turn while also costing us in terms of bureaucracy on a recurring basis. We'll do a broad conversation on institutions in the future, but you should know that there are classes of institutions and laws that generate political strength for your landowners. These are generally pretty dangerous if your goal is to make political progress in the game, because landowners are generally opposed to everything. So just be aware, anytime you see this purple symbol, your hackles should be raised. Bureaucracy is also used for trade routes as well as for commanders. So commanders, they cost a flat amount as well as increasing for each level of promotion that you give to the commander in question. In the beginning of the game, if you're a nation like Sardinia-Piedmont, you're not going to have an infinitely large army to begin with, so you probably don't need to promote your commanders. As your nation gets larger and larger and your military gets more and more complicated, you're probably going to need to invest more and more government administration towards not only the promotion of generals, but also the military political infrastructure. So that's why there's a bureaucracy cost here. And then there's a bureaucracy cost for trade routes, just to represent the cost of the government in terms of doing the paperwork to ensure that, customs are being paid, or tariffs are being paid, or things are being properly insured and packaged and distributed. There's less of that, of course, under certain law forms because there are fewer restrictions in place. Now, why are we talking about bureaucracy as a capacity and investing so much time to just talking about them? It's because of the building that they come from. So the building that you get bureaucracy from is pretty different from a lot of the other buildings in the game. Most buildings in the game are going to be owned by private individuals. They're going to have cash reserves. They're going to pay investment pool if their cash reserves are full and they're collecting dividends. But also the buildings in turn employ pops that are going to be paid wages that you can then tax, and the wages are going to be paid by the building rather than by the state. That's not the case for a couple of specific buildings: government administration buildings, universities, and ports. And so that means that any of these buildings that you build will increase your budgetary needs. If you exclusively build government administration buildings, you'll end up with lots and lots of bureaucracy, but no way to economically sustain it. The government administration buildings, in addition to having government employees that you need to pay for, also buy paper. Paper is something that you can change by switching around your methods of production, and that's another critical thing here in Victoria 3. Your methods of production are just as important as what you build, because it's not just what the capital is, but how the capital is used that in turn influences the society that is produced by the capital. That's what economic determinism is really all about. If we went down to a simple organization on our government administration, the building would no longer consume paper, but in turn it would produce less bureaucracy because it would be less efficient. Without the input good of paper, it's harder to run a government bureaucracy. There's also production methods that are going to modify what sort of pops are working and how many pops. In this case, in this government administration, hereditary bureaucrats and professional bureaucrats are gated by what sort of laws your government has access to. By and large, most methods of production are going to derive from technology rather than from laws, but there are a handful of them that come from laws. Right now, we are on hereditary bureaucrats, which means that, unfortunately for us, our government administration buildings are going to be employing aristocrats. That in turn means that our landowners are going to be more powerful, which in turn means our nation is going to be harder to liberalize. Now, how do I know all of this? It's because of the nature of a building. A building is going to employ pops, give them jobs, but those pops are in turn going to associate with certain interest groups, largely based off of their profession, although not exclusively. You can see here that the aristocrats are supporting landowners, but also armed forces and also the intelligentsia. And you can see here these bureaucrats are supporting the intelligentsia and the petite bourgeoisie and the armed forces. If you're building a lot of aristocrats, you're going to be in turn building up the strength of the landowner, and that in turn is going to mean that whatever sort of things the landowner wants, generally these things are bad, are going to be harder to change. So you don't want to skimp on bureaucracy, because if your bureaucracy is negative, if you ever go over your capacity, you do suffer something called tax waste. Tax waste is really bad. Taxes that are collected from your pops, but then that money just gets burned up. So it's not there for the pops to be able to consume goods with, therefore grow your economy, but it's also not getting you money. So having a negative bureaucracy is pretty bad. Positive bureaucracy gives you a state construction efficiency bonus. This is a small thing. Ultimately, it's very expensive to try to get state construction efficiency from a bureaucracy excess rather than just like build a bunch of construction sectors. That's usually easier. But be aware that this is a global bonus, and so this is going to be making progress even in unincorporated states that are suffering a lot of turmoil. An excess of bureaucracy can solve a lot of different problems. It can just be very expensive to obtain. Next up, we have authority. Authority represents sort of the personal authority of the ruler within the state based off of either laws or cultural obligations. Generally speaking, authority is going to be higher in a state that has more authoritarian laws. Monarchy, autocracy, national supremacy, state religion, censorship. These things in turn generate a much more repressive society, but they also create a more stratified society that allows for the characters at the top to make more decisions on the fly. And that's sort of what authority represents. It represents concentrated power within the hands of a few individuals then being used to form the nature of the state. So authority, when it's not being spent, gives you an enactment time bonus. This is a very important thing whenever you're doing any sort of meaningful changes in regards to your laws. Generally, it's easier to get a lot of enactment time bonuses by being in righteous government, but in order to be be in righteous government, you need a very high legitimacy, and sometimes that can be difficult to come by. So be aware that if you ever really need to get a law done, you can just strand authority, and then the stranded authority will help you make really meaningful progress on the roles for your laws. Authority in turn can be spent on sort of petty laws. There are a couple of different classifications of petty laws that you can spend authority on. You can spend it to suppress or bolster specific interest groups. What this will do in turn is change the interest group pop attraction based off of whatever laws and institutions you have in place that modify bolstering and suppressing. But it doesn't just like magically create clout out of nowhere. Bolstering and suppressing just means that the existing pops in your country are going to naturally filter either towards or away from those interest groups in the politics that they support. That's a roundabout way to say if you're using authority to bolster or suppress specific interest groups, make sure you're doing it for a very specific reason. It doesn't transform your society on its own. It just tinkers with it a little bit. So if we were to bolster the industrialists here, the industrialists specifically actually can only have pops of a couple of different professions: capitalists, engineers, and shopkeepers. By bolstering them, we would increase the number of capitalists, engineers, and shopkeepers that are attracted to the industrialists. But you can see here that 63% of the capitalists are associated with the industrialists already. 26% of the engineers are associated with the industrialists, but these are part of the middle strata, which means they have access to generally less wealth, which means they have generally less political strength. So you can see engineers here have 6.33k political strength, whereas capitalists have 111k political strength. That's something that's a consequence of the nature of your society. The more autocratic your society is, the more that power derives from wealth. The more democratic your society is, the more political power derives from votes. So what that means is, if you were to bolster the industrialists, we might get more of these engineers or these shopkeepers to be attracted to the industrialists, but most of the capitalists are already associated with the industrialists, and so the political impact of doing it here by bolstering the industrialists is pretty limited. It can be quite valuable to suppress landowners because there are a lot of interest groups that can attract their most important profession, the aristocrats. And so if you start suppressing your landowners and bolstering your armed forces and your intelligentsia, you can do a lot of work to try to reduce the power of the aristocrats. Ultimately, you're going to need to make changes in your society, not by interacting with the interest groups directly, but by interacting with your economy. I would encourage you to spend your authority on consumption taxes and decrees. At the beginning of the game, if you're a very large nation, then you should shy away from decrees and lean into consumption taxes. As a smaller nation, you should shy away from consumption taxes and lean more heavily on decrees because of the nature of the petty law in question. So a decree gives you a state modifier. In this case, road maintenance gives us a little bit of extra state construction efficiency, a little bit of extra infrastructure. Promote social mobility gets us education access. Greener grass campaign gets us migration attraction. But it modifies only one state. As the game progresses, as your nation grows, you'll have more and more states. Here is Sardinia-Piedmont, we only have 3, and so using decrees is very powerful because it's relatively inexpensive and it gets us a whole lot of modification on these states in question. But if we had 100 states here, that's where consumption taxes step in as an outlet for authority use. They're also really good just for generating top-line revenue for you as a nation state. You do need money in order to make statecraft function, so consumption taxes are good. Consumption taxes are also good because they're targeted. These are specific goods that people or pops buying these goods will have to pay taxes on. That in turn means that the pops who are buying these goods are going to have less wealth, and because they'll have less wealth, they'll have less power, and as they have less power, they'll be able to resist us less and less. So generally speaking, consumption taxes, you want to be targeting them at whatever your political opponents for the campaign are. Services, wine, liquor, these are either sin taxes or they're going to be goods that are consumed largely by wealthy pops. That's why you pay less in terms of authority. Creating a grain tax is something that's wildly unpopular and would require a lot of effort. Taxing luxury clothes or liquor, that's usually pretty easy to get society to sign off on. As the game goes on and your economy grows, you'll have even more money that you can make on consumption taxes. But as the game goes on, you're also going to find that you want to become less and less autocratic most of the time. The reason being, of course, is that as you become more liberal, more people will want to move to you, and a critical resource input for you in Victoria 3 is just raw pops. It's very difficult to make good progress in the game if your industrialization loop runs out of growth, and while growth can be sustained via electricity or coal or whatever, you do ultimately need citizens both to work the jobs as well as to pay you taxes, and to ensure that, you want to make a liberal society. Liberal societies are going to be defined by multiculturalism or cultural exclusion instead of national supremacy, total separation or freedom of conscience instead of state religion, just because these liberalizations in terms of social laws are going to make more and more pops in the game want to move to your country. And migration in the mid to late game is going to be a very critical piece of your population growth. So be aware that although authority starts strong and gives you the ability to do some petty laws in a couple of different states, it does drop off. In the mid to late game, you can create an authority stack by just going to like command economy and autocracy and council republic and create sort of a USSR situation. But if you're doing that, you're almost certainly running just an awful lot of consumption taxes, because a larger state in the mid to late game really can't get value out of promote social mobility. It just doesn't do a lot there. Up next, we have influence. Influence is meant to represent sort of soft power. It represents your diplomatic standing in the world, but also your way to leverage that diplomatic standing with other nations. One of the most important things when it comes to influence is the bonus you get for excess influence generation. If you have more influence in terms of your generated balance than you have currently spent, then you'll get an infamy decay bonus. So in this case, we haven't spent any influence on anything. Let's go ahead and start spending influence on improving relations in Italy. So now that we've assigned all of this influence and soft power to influencing our fellow friends in Italy, we're getting way less infamy decay. Fortunately for us, influence is something that's like pseudo-fungible. People will respect your words more if you promise to be their friend, if you've also stated that somebody else is your enemy. In this point, we're probably not going to rival Spain, but if we get an opportunity to rival Portugal, I'm all in for it, because I don't think Portugal can stop us from unifying Italy. Influence is one of these things that's going to be coming from your diplomacy and going to your diplomacy. It is modifiable by technology the same way that authority and bureaucracy is modified by technology. You can see here that we get a little bonus from empiricism, but most of your influence is going to be coming from your rank in the world. We'll talk about rank and prestige in due turn, but just be aware that the larger and more powerful you are, the more influence you have in the world. So in order to grow your influence, you do kind of need to grow your economy, but that's what this video series is all about. Up next, we have convoys. Convoys represent your nation or your empire's capacity for naval infrastructure. This is stuff that's going to be generated from your ports and go towards your trade routes, your port connections, and your supply routes. So convoys are important because trade routes are very important. You'll make a lot of money doing trade in Victoria 3 if you set your society up well. But it's also important because it does primarily come from your ports, and ports are things that are going to be paid government wages. And just like government administration buildings, you don't want to bankrupt yourself building convoys just to build your trade economy. You want to be building a real economy alongside a trade economy. Fortunately, you can also get convoys from an empire if you have a subject, but generally speaking, you are going to need to grow your convoys as much as possible in Victoria 3 just to sustain your trade, because trade is a very important thing in Victoria 3 that we will address in a future video. Basically, trade is the thing that's going to help you grow your GDP. If you're not currently using free trade, then you should be. Trade routes, port connections, and supply routes all use these little nodes here. This is the way that your supply network and your trade is actually going to work. It's going to go through these individual C nodes, and the further away you are trying to either do trade or get supply, the more convoys you're going to need in order to do that. That's why the canals are so important in Victoria 3. They save you enormous amounts of convoys depending on where your trade centers and your capital are. Especially if you're playing as Italy, you need need the Suez Canal if you're going to be doing any sort of trade with China. And doing trade with China is usually pretty good. In Victoria 3, one of the easiest ways to get very powerful is to naval invade people. It's generally harder to naval invade great powers these days, but naval invading secondary and minor powers is still quite good. But in order to support those, you do need a fleet infrastructure to ensure that your troops are actually getting food and ammunition and guns. And that's what supply routes represent. So convoys, these are a critical part of infrastructure that the game is just kind of showing you. The reason it's up here is because it is treated as a capacity. If you go under your convoy balance, you just start having market access problems. That is a big problem. Do not do that. Market access cuts apart your economy very, very slowly. And fortunately, having excess convoys gives you trade route competitiveness, which means that if you're trying to compete for demand or supply of a specific trade partner, you're more likely to get the goods in question or to sell the goods in question than your other trade competitors. So convoys are always good. They're just expensive because ports are paid for by the government. Up next, we have money. Money is manifested in a couple of different ways. So the first thing you have here are your gold reserves or your credit if you're running into credit. Gold reserves represent an excess of money that you have in the bank. In the beginning of the game, you pretty much always start with medium gold reserves. But gold reserves are simultaneously good and bad. It means that you have excess money. You have a rainy day fund, which is very nice in the event that you end up in a great power war. But it also means that that money is not currently being spent on growth. And one of the most important things in Victoria 3 is just trying to maximize your growth as much as possible. You also do not want to go above your gold reserve limit, because at that point you're kind of suffering from tax waste again, causes you to just burn up money. If your gold reserves are running above your gold reserve limit, you're also just burning up money because you have to buy gold at a depleting rate. Don't do that. Credit is also available. In Victoria 3, every building that's privately owned is going to have a cash reserve associated with it. This cash reserve is going to define the limit of your credit. In this case, 1.46 million is the total credit limit available on all of the cash reserves on all of the buildings in the entire country. As you build more and more buildings and you build more and more credit, you can float into the red more and more often. But be aware that credit isn't free. Interest rate is derived from your rank as well as your technology, as well as your recognition status. Here is Sardinia-Piedmont. Fortunately, Metternich and his friends says we're cool and let us into the back end of the club. But be aware that credit isn't free, and it's very, very strong to get your interest rate very low, so that way it's as free as possible. So that way if you need to use your credit limit to keep your growth growing, you can. If you're playing as a very small, unrecognized minor nation, stay away from credit. It can be extremely expensive if you're paying a very high interest rate. But if you can get it down to zero, then credit's free. Just take as much credit as you feel like you need to. Up next, we have investment pool. Investment pool represents sort of the background private capital that exists inside of your nation. That private capital goes out in search of ways to invest itself. It's meant more as an abstract way to represent private investment in an economy, but investment pool is going to be derived from the dividends of a building. Just as your buildings create your credit limit, your buildings are also going to be creating your investment pool. They're going to be creating your investment pool modified by the nature of your economic system and what technologies you have access to and what sort of ownership methods you have in place. But they're going to be coming from buildings that have cash reserves as well as subsistence farms. Investment pool is just sort of a little extra weekly balance that you get here. Reinvestment £468 means that these subsistence farms are feeding into our investment pool, and the investment pool is in turn using some of our construction capacity to build this logging camp. But fortunately, this construction is being paid for via this investment pool transfer. Investment pool is also modified currently by the size of your GDP, so the larger your economy gets, the less efficient investment pool becomes. This is why in the mid to late game it can be useful to move away from an investment pool strategy and toward communism or socialism. Growing your economy is always good. You just happen to grow it a little more efficiently when it's small. National revenue and fixed national expenses are kind of important to keep in mind, but be aware that fixed national expenses doesn't factor in your temporary national expenses, which are your construction goods. And construction is really critical here in Victoria 3 because it's the way you're going to transform your society. National revenue is your top line number in regards to how much money the state is taking in. Depending on what sort of tax laws you have in place, you're probably going to be getting some income taxes and poll taxes at the beginning of the game. You'll also probably be be doing some consumption taxing. But as the game evolves and as your tax laws become more and more complicated, getting access to dividend tax rate and phasing out your poll taxes. But an important thing to note here are tariffs. I would encourage most players, and we will talk about this when we get there, to just move into free trade, which doesn't give you any tariffs, but it does give you a massive bonus on trade route volume, trade route bureaucracy cost, and trade route competitiveness. Overall, your economy is just going to be a lot stronger if you have free trade. The only downside, of course, is that it is disallowed by command economy, so if you're trying to build a powerful authoritarian state, you can't do it with free trade dodoy. But largely, as your economy is built out, you're going to see tariffs are not going to increase at the same rate as everything else. They're generally pretty small, and they're also generally pretty expensive to develop because you don't get access to this bureaucracy cost or trade route volume. You're going to just be conducting way less trade total if you're on any of the other laws, which means that your tariffs in turn are going to have to be smaller. Minting is one of these things that's going to depend an awful lot on what sort of society you have. Minting comes from your GDP, but it also comes from gold if you have access to it. Gold is a special resource in Victoria 3 that generates minting just like flat to you, no matter if it's incorporated or unincorporated, doesn't matter, here's money. But it doesn't scale particularly well. Generally speaking, gold is very valuable at the beginning of the game and less valuable as your society gets more and more complex. You moved away from gold rushes during this time period towards oil rushes, towards coal rushes, right? Where you found black gold was way more important in the 19 teens than where you found gold. Part of that is, of course, is that gold veins had been tapped out, but it's also just telling you that the nature of an economy has changed over the time frame of this game in a way that emphasizes different things as being valuable. Up next, we have radicals and loyalists. Radicals and loyalists are really, to me, an output metric more than anything else. Don't worry too much about manipulating these, and rather concern yourself with what they do to your economy. A radical is just an angry person in your society. Angry people in your society can be extremely valuable. If you want to implement a council republic in Victoria 3, for instance, then you almost certainly need a lot of radicals, and you generally want your trade unions to be as angry as possible, so that way they push for dramatic solutions to society's problems. Radicals have been nerfed a little bit in 1.3 because they no longer provide you with multiculturalism, but radicals support presidential republic, universal suffrage, protected speech, guaranteed liberties, and depending on what your goals are as a nation, radicals can be quite useful. So just be aware that if you're trying to accomplish the goals of the radical, then having radicals is actually a good thing. If you have a lot of radicals, a lot of angry people, in turn, the political interest groups in your nation are probably going to be angry at the state. They will give you less bonuses. Maybe they will form a revolutionary group. In Victoria 3, if there's a lot of angry people living in a specific state, you'll generate something called turmoil. Turmoil is a big problem for early societies. As you develop a law enforcement and an internal security institution, you're going to have fewer and fewer problems with turmoil and radicals. But be aware that if you are a relatively undeveloped nation like Central America here, and you have a lot of turmoil, that can cause problems. Central America is a special case. They just start with an awful lot of turmoil and radicals, and then from there, the society is kind of scripted to fall apart. But if you have tons and tons of radicals, and your interest groups are really mad at you, and you have a lot of turmoil in your nation, and you aren't building a law enforcement and an internal security, you're just asking for trouble. Loyalists, on the other hand, are going to be mostly there just to make your interest groups a little happier. Generally, loyalists are going to be attracting moderates, which makes your politics more predictable, but not necessarily stronger. Because sometimes in Victoria 3, and during this time frame in particular, you do need drastic change in order to accomplish drastic things. And if we're trying to make line go up, the bog standard average moderate landowner is probably less useful to us than, say, a jingoist, because a jingoist is going to give the leader of this particular interest group a new ideology that in turn will be in favor of specific changes in regards to their laws. So just be aware that loyalists can actually be a bad thing if you just end up with a bunch of moderates and interest groups where you need specific ideologies. Then loyalists are a problem. In the mid to late game, they're less of a problem because they do scale pretty well. But in the beginning of the game, don't think of this as good, this is bad. It's really more the other way around. Population is another really critical thing. Of course, it's a critical thing. There's a critical part of your population that I think you need to be aware of, and it's peasants. So peasants represent simultaneously the resource for as well as the victims of progress in Victoria 3. These are the people who are having their livelihoods being disrupted by urbanization. They're the people who are moving from the countryside to the big cities to work in the big factories, or moving to the mines eventually to do resource extraction. But right now, these people are just working on subsistence farms. Peasants are barely economized. They don't buy a lot of goods because they are peasants, and peasants actually have a decreased purchase demand for goods because most of their personal good consumption is just stuff they make for themselves. This means that any peasant in turn is going to be less useful for you as a consumer than they would be if they were just a strict laborer or a farmer, even at the same wealth amount. Unfortunately for peasants, their problems don't stop as being poor consumers. They're also just not very wealthy because most of their money is going to be coming from this thing called subsistence output, which is a flat amount that comes from the subsistence farm in question. But it's also non-taxable, which means that these peasants, they're really not generating a lot of value or good for a society that's trying to industrialize. But fortunately for you, whenever you build a new building, you create jobs. The peasants, as long as the building is profitable, will move to that building, take up the new jobs, and then your society will make some progress. Be aware that at a certain point you may hit no peasants and no unemployed, and then you really do need to be aware of the power of automation. But you also have an underlying way to modify your total workable population by addressing dependence. So during this time frame, there were a lot of changes in regards to things like children's rights and rights of women. How many dependents you actually have is a factor of the profession in question as well as the laws that you have. They still don't make anywhere near as much as a truly fully employed pop. And so one of the critical things in Victoria 3 in order to grow your standard of living is to make sure that you have as few dependents as possible and as many people working as many value-adding jobs as possible. So up next we have standard of living. Standard of living is sort of like the wild card in the room. There are a lot of people who struggle to understand standard of living and conceptualize it as a thing. Standard of living is mostly a metric that describes how wealthy your lower strata is for the beginning of the game. And then in the middle of the game, it starts telling you a little bit more about your middle class and how many people you have participating in consumption. But by and large, standard of living is going to be influenced by how many peasants you have at the beginning of the game. Because again, peasants, they basically don't consume anything, and their income is heavily limited based off of their subsistence. And so if you want to increase your standard of living in Victoria 3, you really do want to build away all of your peasants. You can see here that they pay an average of 20% of their income in taxes, or 19.5% of their income in taxes, which is why if you can get out of a law system that has a poll tax, your lower strata will have access to a lot more money and your standard of living will go up. But this should also make it clear that outside of the poll taxes, taxes are really not a big influence on the standard of living for your pops. If you give pops access to money, generally speaking, they'll do a very good job of maximizing their own standard of living. So just give your pops money, build stuff. That's how you make your standard of living go up. Up next, we have literacy. Literacy is a really important metric when it comes to human development. It's tracked worldwide even now. And it is, of course, very important in terms of describing your society, but it's also important to understand how you influence it. So one thing that I see people trying to do in order to max out their literacy is build a bunch of universities, but universities do not actually generate literacy. Literacy comes from your education access. education access, it's going to come from wealth, it's going to come from your laws, and it's going to come from your decrees if you manage to set down a decree that generates more education access. But universities, these are sort of like finishing schools or colleges. They're not meant to teach people literacy. So in order to drive up your literacy rate, you do need to make your population wealthy and give them access to a school or education system. Getting an education system online very early is very, very important if you want to do any sort of technological development as well, because it has a lag. You don't just institute religious schools and then all of a sudden everybody knows how to read better. Literacy will also describe or limit your innovation cap. The more literate your society is, the more you can try to research cutting edge techs. And so maximizing your innovation allows you to have more control over the technologies that you research, but innovation is itself going to be capped by your literacy. Literacy is also going to give you tech spread. The more literate your society is, the more it's going to interact with the ideas that exist in other societies. But the more repressive your laws are, you see there that minus 10% on censorship, the more repressive your laws are, the harder it's going to be for your society to interact with ideas in other societies. So literacy is important, but it's not the only thing, and it really is more of an output than it is anything else, because there are so few ways to modify it. GDP is sort of the harbinger of the end. This is the line that most people think about when they think about line go up. GDP represents the total value of all goods that are going to be consumed in an end point in your nation. So that means all goods that are going to be consumed by your pops and all goods that are being sold as exports in trade routes. But it is based off of the value of the goods. And so if you crash the price of a specific good within your market, like if you crash the price of grain in an effort to increase your standard of living, you would actually decrease the GDP value of your grain just by making it cost less. Now, fortunately, if you crash the price of grain, most of the time pops will take that money, grow their wealth, grow their standard of living, then start buying other goods instead. But if you crash the price of grain, everybody who makes money from the price of grain, everyone working on subsistence farms and wheat farms, will make less money in turn. Their goods are selling for less. And so that will also hurt your standard of living. So you want to be aware that GDP rewards you for not manipulating the prices of goods, and the way that goods work in turn also rewards you for not manipulating the prices of goods. So lean into that if you're going to be playing as a historical force here in Victoria 3. GDP is going to be defined largely by your internal consumption, but trade is a valuable way to grow your GDP too. Free trade will definitely help you there, I promise. But I think the best metric is actually one that unfortunately we do not currently get a line to go up. It is prestige. So prestige is this broad sum total metric that tells you largely how powerful your nation is. It's going to be derived from your gross domestic product, your army power projection, a little bit from your country tier, your navy power projection, critical technologies, but also from being a leading producer of a specific good, from the navy power projection and army power projection of your subjects, the GDP of your subjects. And so prestige, this hidden number here that in turn defines our rank, is really the most important metric in the game in Victoria 3 if you're playing as an industrial historical force, because it takes everything into account. It's also important because it in turn informs your rank, and your rank is going to give you access to more influence, more maneuvers per diplo play, which means you can do better wars, more agitators, which are really important in the current build for Victoria 3. And so what your prestige gives you is a little different from what the rest of these things give you, because this is something that is inherently manipulatable by player action in a lot of different ways, but it is a number that you usually want to be promoting as much as possible. And then I think the episode after that, we're going to get going. So look forward to that and more here on We Play Games. I'm Walker. Take care.